people aren't going to have money soon. If we don't change the policies, we're going to have a global blowout much, much bigger than 2008, probably much bigger than 1929 to 33. And people will lose everything.
Hey guys, welcome back. I have on the line the national spokesperson for the LaRouche organization. It's Harley Schlanger, an historian and an all-around great guy. Harley, welcome back.
Good to be with you, Sean.
And guys, before we get started with Harley, I want to apologize for the overmodulation on his mic. We tried to troubleshoot that before the call began, and we weren't able to fix it. He is understandable. This just isn't as pleasant sounding as it normally is, so bear with us. Lots of important information covered in this interview. Hey, Harley, let me ask you a question to get started here. Got a story to tell you. Are you familiar with the show that aired on HBO for several seasons called Entourage?
I'm familiar with it. I haven't seen it.
Yeah, well, they did a movie recently, too, and the star of that show, the guy on the show who played Vinny Chase, the Hollywood movie star, his name is Adrian Grenier, and he posted recently, on 9/11 actually, on the anniversary of 9/11 here, he posted what is called a controversial 9/11 Instagram that offended many, and I think it speaks to the core of what we're up against, Harley, because I was talking to my friend Mark Mann last night, and he and I were lamenting the fact that the American people seem unable to wake up and are happy to allow this government to do anything it likes in the name of 9/11 and the war on terror. Let me read you this. So Adrian Grenier, hope I'm pronouncing that right, or Grenier, he posted something on 9/11. It was a picture of the Twin Towers, and it said, R.I.P. the 2,996 Americans who died on 9/11. R.I.P. the 1,450,590 innocent Iraqis who died during the U.S. invasion for something they didn't do. That's all it said. And there was an outcry by, I guess, 539,000 of this guy's followers that lashed out against him in the comments section for having posted that truth. Some of them who called them expletives, and he took the thing down because he wanted to shelter himself from the anger of his fans. Harley, does that not speak to the absolute insanity of the American public at large? What are we going to do about this culture, Harley? These people are out of their minds.
Well, this is the real question, because you can argue the facts with people, and people have their own set of facts and their own set of opinions. Very few people actually think. And the problem we're facing is that we've become, I hate to use this term, but it's the only accurate term, we've become dumbed down. And it's a result of, I think, a combination of a consumer society which convinces you that money is everything. It's a money society. And there are things that can be done to change it. I mean, one of the things that will be done to change it is people aren't going to have money soon. If we don't change the policies, we're going to have a global blowout much, much bigger than 2008, probably much bigger than 1929 to 33. And people will lose everything. Now, will people do the right thing if that happens? Well, the only thing you can do, Sean, is try to organize people to think and give them an alternative set of policy options before these things happen. And you hope that enough people will wake up. But as you know from reading on the comment section all the time on your interviews, a lot of people are convinced that nothing's going to change. Now, I can't wake up every morning and come into the office if I actually believed you couldn't change things. And what's important, what we're going to talk about today, is how a very well thought out strategy created a change that opens a new potential for us. And what I'm talking about is how Putin outflanked Obama on this phony war on terror. If the Americans could think, Putin would be a hero in the United States right now.
Well, you're right, because it seems to me that a grand chessboard, a grand game of chess is being played, as Zygmunt Brzezinski liked to write in his book. A grand game of chess is being played, and right now on the world stage, Putin has the upper hand because the U.S. government has lost all credibility. In fact, it's now clear to any nation or person paying attention that it is the U.S. government responsible for the terrorist acts in Syria because, of course, ISIS is being funded and supported by this government. And in this article from Zero Hedge, Harley, we see that 2,000 Russian troops are headed to Syria for first phase of mission to support Assad. This thing is now becoming overt in that it is going to be Russian troops versus Black Ops American troops. Harley, so what's your take on what's going on in Syria?
Well, I'll tell you what Lyndon LaRouche said last week, which was really interesting, is that we're actually moving away from the danger of thermonuclear war. Not that it's not still there, but Obama is a big loser right now in the eyes of the world. And with the UN General Assembly meeting coming up, and forget that it's the UN, the important thing is the world's leaders are going to be gathering in New York City, and Putin is chairing the meeting. What Putin did was to expose the fraud of the so-called U.S. war on terror. Because by saying that the Russians are going to support the Assad government and will provide increased logistical support, arms, and personnel, and really fight ISIS, this exposes the fact that the U.S. policy is actually to get rid of Assad and put ISIS in power in Damascus. Now, I don't think that's what many of the people in the U.S. military intend. I think there are people in the military who are secretly cheering the fact that Putin is doing this because they know that our engagement in Syria is a losing proposition. The idea that we're going to arm moderate Syrians, that's a cover for providing arms to ISIS and al-Nusra. Now, what Putin did is to say that the issue is if you are going to fight ISIS, you cannot destroy the Assad government. Obama has been carrying out a policy that goes back to the Bush policy of regime change. And the regime change is not aimed just at Assad, but at Russia. And we saw the same kind of thing that was played out in Ukraine. What happened in both of those cases is that they can't follow it through because Obama is not a strategic thinker. He's a puppet. And he's a puppet for people who are trying to preserve a bankrupt global financial system by forcing Russia and China to accept the globalization under the bankers. And they refused to do it. Now, Putin took his time before he moved. But the Russians are going to be deploying with Syria. The Syrians already are using the new planes provided, the new jets provided by the Russians. And the thing that the U.S. doesn't have, that our military doesn't have, is a cooperating agency to work with because the U.S. is opposing the Assad government. Assad has managed to survive in spite of a coalition which includes Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, the U.S., and NATO. And he survived because he's supported by the majority of the people in Syria. Now, what changed in the last weeks is, number one, the refugee crisis forced the Europeans to ask the question, why are there refugees? And the reason is because our war on terror is really a destruction of nations so that these countries are becoming unlivable. And we're seeing from Germany, even though Merkel had been a complete puppet of Obama and the British, Merkel is now saying, let's talk to the Russians. The French are saying, let's talk to the Russians. Putin has overturned the chessboard, so to speak. And so he's coming into New York City with the UN General Assembly meeting with a certain amount of strength internationally. Now, what's the real problem? It's what you said in the beginning. Where's the American population on this? Are we so mesmerized by that fraud Donald Trump and Carly Fiorina and the Hillary campaign that we're going to sit there and ignore what's happening in the world? Well, that seems to be what's happening. But you and I know, Sean, there's a ferment in the American people, which is the reason Trump and Fiorina and Sanders are having surges in the polls. There's an opposition to this political elite, opposition to globalization, to this idea that we can have a permanent war, not just against so-called terror, but against our own population. And we've got to make sure that there are real solutions put out there. Because what Putin did was expose what was obvious to you, which is that Obama is a fraud. The war on terror is a fraud. There's another agenda that they have. And part of that agenda is population reduction, including of the American population. So I think people are going to wake up. We've just got to make sure they have policy options.
Yeah, you're right, Harley. It It seems that the hour is very late, though, for this American republic. Many of the people that I've interviewed have made the argument that the U.S. has long since been a corporation, and there really is no republic. And it makes sense when you look at the big picture. We get betrayed at every turn by our quote-unquote representatives. And so to try to take this thing back does seem a little hopeless, but I want to inspire hope. But you know where I get defeated, where I get sort of spiritually defeated, Harley, is when I see news like that post that Adrian Grenier made, where 550,000 people freaked out because he just told a truth. He told a cold, hard truth about the overreach of our militaristic government in Iraq. That's a fact. It's a fact that Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, right?
Yeah.
They conflated 9/11, so the government conflated 9/11 so that they could get us into all of these endless unconstitutional wars of aggression. So a guy in Hollywood points that out, and people freak out because they love war. They love this paradigm of USA, USA, USA. And it's the most frightening thing I can imagine, Harley, because the America that I grew up in the America that the listeners love, that was a different America. That was an America that really did stand for good. We thought. We all stood for good. And, when you do something wrong, you have to own up to it. You have to be contrite. You have to apologize. You have to try to do better next time. But the American people appear not to want that, Harley. They just want more war. And I guess at the end of the day, all we can do is pray for things to turn around. I guess the good news, Harley, is you're saying things are turning around on the world stage, regardless of what the American people want or do or don't do.
Well, that's exactly the point. You see this emerging new paradigm around the BRICS. Now, there are people who say, oh, the BRICS are really the Rothschilds in their next incarnation. And don't be confused by what I'm about to say. I know that the people who have bankrupted this system are trying to figure out what to do next, and they're looking for any ship they can jump on to take it over. But what people are missing is that Russia does represent an independent national force. The Chinese, with all their problems, are looking for the benefit of their country, which they see as dependent on doing good things for other countries. Isn't that the way we used to think? And so I think in spite of all the cynicism that comes out from people who do know some things about the world, about the BRICS and these kinds of things, I think there is a potential paradigm shift. And you see the intensity of the fight, the attempt to overthrow Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, the attacks on China, the so-called Asia pivot, the militarization of Japan, the Ukraine situation, the Middle East, the attacks on Russia. But these countries are standing up and they're doing what Americans won't do, which is they're facing reality and they're fighting. And the reason is because they have leadership. Putin represents a national interest that most Russian people share. Now, the problem in the U.S. is simple. The two parties are one party and they're owned by the corporations and the banks. Why hasn't a single Republican, well, Rand Paul to a minor extent broke in that second debate with the Iraq war scenario, but everyone else jumped on board Jeb Bush when he said we're safer because of what George W. Bush did, which is a complete lie. And I can't believe that the American people believe that. Every day we're seeing outbreaks of terror and chaos and breakdown in civilization. We're not safer. We're much more in danger than we've ever been. However, as you see this thing emerge internationally, the question really that you're raising is one that LaRouche asked many, many years ago. Do the American people have the moral fitness to survive? That's the test that's put in front of us right now. On the surface, if you believed in the empirical evidence, as you referenced this reaction to the Hollywood guy on the Iraq War, it would appear that we don't have the moral fitness to survive. You look at the Republican debate, you look at the Democratic primary. You know the one thing that's missing from the whole political discussion? Why won't anyone stand up and say Obama is either the greatest failure in American history or he's successfully destroying the United States? Why won't they come out and fight Obama? Why do the Republicans give him a pass? Why does Bernie Sanders oppose a lot of Obama's policies but then turn around to praise Obama? This is where you see the moral cowardice in the American people, from its political leaders down to the man on the street.
Right.
But I think the man on the street doesn't really feel comfortable with these kinds of things. For example, you mentioned over 500,000 complaints about the comment on the Iraq War. Remember what happened when Obama was preparing to attack Syria? What was it, 2 or 3 years ago,
Yep.
over the so-called gas incident?
There was an outcry, and the American public helped stop that.
Absolutely. Remember when the bailout started, there was an outcry that almost derailed the attempt to do the bailout in September 2008. Right. There's an instinct in the American people for justice and the good. There's just no leadership. And the people who might possibly lead it have been so beaten and slandered and attacked that people are afraid to say, well, I agree with LaRouche, or I agree with Ron Paul on the question of the Fed, or I agree with this one or that one. People are afraid. That's the whole point of a national security state, is to intimidate people so they'll adopt so-called solutions which are actually against their own personal interest.
Right.
So our job, and when I say our, I include you in this because I commend you for the work you do at SGT Report by giving a voice to people who know something is wrong and who actually have some ideas on it. We've just got to be out there as a clarion call for sanity.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, that is the goal of the alternative media at large. I mean, all of the great sites out there doing excellent work. The Truth Stream Medias of the world, the Zero Hedges, naturalnews.com. There's so many great people doing great work, and it's in the effort to wake up the American people. And that's what we're trying to do here. I have 3 more topics I want to talk to you about before we lose you, Harley. Number 1, you mentioned the militarization of Japan. I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about Obama's concern that he actually articulated not long ago about a nuclear device going off in New York City. And I want to ask you about Deutsche Bank and the situation in Germany. So, Harley, a moment ago you mentioned the militarization of Japan. I actually was talking to Mark S. Mann about this last night in our phone conversation. We talked about so many things just so that we could vent to each other about so many of these things that we cover and are worried about. What do you make of the militarization of Japan? Because you couldn't find a more docile population of neutered men than the population of Japan. And I would make the argument, Harley, that you want to talk about the desperation of the New World Order and the Pentagon and the people in charge of this country. Try to militarize Japan, right? I know it's a vassal state. It's essentially a proxy state, I think, of the United States after World War II. And, of course, who's the buyer of last resort of our treasuries when Russia and China doesn't want them anymore? Well, you got the Fed and you've got Japan. And Japan, I think, is being forced at gunpoint to play their role. And now they're being told you have to militarize so you can help us go to more war. That's not going to work with the neutered population of men they have in Japan. Plus, none of them want to go to war. So, Harley, what's going on with this militarization of Japan?
Well, Japan historically, in the last 150 years, has been a center of British interests in Asia. This goes back to the funding of the militarization of Japan at the beginning of the 20th century that led to Japan defeating Russia in the Russia-Japan War of 1905. It goes to World War II. There's a grouping in Japan which has essentially bought into the globalist operation. This was the part of Japan that was in the Trilateral Commission. But you also have senior industrial figures in Japan who have opposed this grouping, and they oppose the quantitative easing. Japan's now going into the 3rd decade of quantitative easing, and it hasn't worked. If you want an argument against just throwing money at a problem, look at Japan. So the idea that you're going to somehow make Japan a militarized force against China is a joke. And competent senior people in Japan know that. But the current Prime Minister, Abe, is essentially part of this trilateral transatlantic plus Japan operation to loot China. It's not going to work. The Chinese demonstrated on their Victory over Japan Day celebration, the 70th anniversary, which took place in Beijing a few weeks ago, that their military is new and modern, even though they spend a fraction on it that we do. They're committed to defending their nation. And the other problem Japan has is South Korea is not going to go along with them. Much of the countries of Asia, except the Philippines and Japan, are rejecting the Asia pivot because they see the future in Eurasia as opposed to the collapsing of the United States and Europe. So it's one of these games that's played by the bankers in the expectation that this will intimidate the Chinese. And it's just not going to work.
No, it's not going to work. And, as I said to Mark Mann in our call, I said, you know what's crazy about what's going on in Syria and around the planet right now with the overreach of our government and these unjustified wars of aggression? When you fight on the side of right, you fight a lot harder than you do when you fight on the side of wrong. And I'll tell you what, taking on Russian troops in Syria or Ukraine or anywhere else it spells disaster for our American men and women because we are not on the side of right. We are fighting globalist, New World Order battles that we have no business fighting.
Hey, Sean, let me just add,
Sure.
There are groupings in the military around the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in the diplomatic corps. Ryan Crocker, for example, who was a Bush guy in Iraq and Pakistan, came out just a couple of days ago and said, look, if Obama wanted to get rid of Assad, he should have gone all out to do it. He didn't. If he wants to defeat ISIS, he should have gone all out and done it. He hasn't. That's why he's lost the initiative. That's why the United States is now the tail that's being wagged by the dog. We don't control our destiny because we've destroyed our moral capacity for leadership.
Right. But we also were in these places under false pretenses, right?
Of course.
We turned Libya into a hellhole. We turned Iraq into a hellhole. We've turned great portions of Afghanistan into a hellhole, and now we're doing the same in Syria, and the world's had enough. I mean, I'll tell you what, I do find it buoying to my spirit that Putin is playing a counterbalance to this aggression, because up to this point, this aggression since 9/11 has been absolutely unopposed by the world.
Nobody's taken it on. The Russians learned their lesson in Libya because they were essentially told, don't veto a UN resolution on Libya because we've just got to get rid of the Gaddafi and then everything will be fine. The Russians figured out, and then it was reinforced on Ukraine, that this is not about democratic forces coming into existence or fighting corruption. It actually is the corrupt networks extending their reach and their control. And so we've seen a fight back from Russia. But what Putin has done, as I said, is he took his time. He waited till Obama was deep into a trap, and then he said, okay, you want to fight ISIS? Good, we're going to come in and join the coalition. And Obama doesn't know what to do.
Oh, yeah. No, that's brilliant. No, it's brilliant. You're right. No, you're absolutely right. Because I understand what's really going on there, I see it as Putin coming in and really taking on the United States and its forces. But in the game of chess, on the world stage, he's saying, you're fighting ISIS? I want to help you fight ISIS. Well, how brilliant, because you and I both know that this government is backing ISIS to topple Assad. And yeah, it's brilliant what he's doing.
It exposes the fraud at the heart of the war on terror.
Yeah, it sure does. Okay.
In a way that thousands of essays couldn't do. You put some Russian troops in there working with Syrian intelligence, and you say, okay, let's root this out. Now, look, it's no slam dunk, because we've allowed a very formidable opponent to be built in ISIS and al-Nusra. But if there's any way to beat it, it's going to be by forcing a shift. Look, Netanyahu was so freaked out, he flew to Moscow to say to Putin, look, you can't let Assad stay in power. And Putin said, look, that's for the Syrians to decide, not you or me. We're just going to help them.
Okay, right. All right. Well, let me ask you this. I wanted to talk to you just a little bit about the global economic collapse picture. There's probably no one that I could speak with who understands Germany and what's going on in Germany, and perhaps at Deutsche Bank better than you, Harley. Can you tell me a little bit about what you see happening on the world stage economically? Because Michael Snyder from the Economic Collapse blog has reported today that he wonders if something is about to happen in Germany that will shake the entire world. He says, according to disturbing new intel that I've received, a major financial event in Germany could be imminent. And he goes on to talk about the problems at Deutsche Bank, one of the largest banks on planet Earth. Harley, what is going on in Germany as it relates to the U.S. dollar, the world economic Ponzi scheme, the falling dominoes? Do you have anything for us about Germany?
Sure. I mean, the Germans have been slavish in their commitment to the transatlantic banking system. Deutsche Bank is essentially a London bank right now. It's got an office in Frankfurt, but all its money is made in their derivatives operations in London. The problem with Germany is that it's an export economy based on the machine tool principle, advanced technology, science, and exports. They've lost their exports to Europe because of the collapse of the European Union economies. The U.S. put sanctions on Russia, which the German government went along with over the great objection of German industrialists. The strength of the German economy is the Mittelstand, the small and medium enterprises. And the government of Germany knows that if they lose their exports, they're not going to survive as an economy. And so they've been waiting for the opportunity to break with this transatlantic policy. It didn't occur over Greece. It didn't occur just over Ukraine, although the Germans are extremely nervous about the prospect of a real war in Ukraine if they continue to support the U.S. puppet regime. They're interested in opening up to Iran. They have incredible openings with China. They're looking at the way the Chinese are moving into Africa and opening that up for European companies that want to join them. So a break is going to occur, and at what you're talking about in terms of an event, I don't know if it'll be one event, but it's a continuing series of events. The collapse of the derivatives markets internationally. The Germans are heavily extended, the German banks, heavily extended in worthless European and U.S. financial paper. And also emerging sector debt. The Germans moved in many ways to loan money to the so-called third world countries with the expectation that an oil boom and some other things would enable that to work. It's not working. Everything's turned against them. So we may see something, whether it's triggered by an event with Deutsche Bank or perhaps the French banking system. Much more in danger now is the French banking system. And we're seeing something interesting also, which is a shift to a positive outlook, which is not just exports, but a change in banking. There's a fight for Glass-Steagall now. The new leader of the Labour Party in Britain is a supporter of Glass-Steagall. There are bills in the Italian Senate, in the European Parliament, in the Austrian Parliament for Glass-Steagall. This is a discussion in Germany that would reject the universal banking system on which the European Union is based. So this is part of the global strategic shift away from a funny money financial system that is a system that will lead to war, because the only way to prop up ultimately all this bad debt is looting, is stealing, is killing people. And the question is, will Europe stick with the United States on this? And we're seeing a complete collapse in the polls in Germany of support for Obama. I mean, look, just think about this for a second. If you live in a European country and you're looking at the U.S. elections and you see that Donald Trump is the front runner and Hillary Clinton is the front runner, what are you thinking about the United States? You begin to think it's a hopeless proposition.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think that's how many of us feel. Okay, well, final question for you. I want to take everybody down the memory hole. Let's jump in the time machine and travel back to March of 2014. And as the listeners know, Harley, governments, intelligence agencies, elements within governments love to use false flag operations and events to wag the dog and to turn the public tide and public opinion in various ways. They use false flag events repeatedly to manipulate us. So, with that said, back on March 26th, 2014, Obama held a press conference with the Dutch Prime Minister at The Hague at the end of the Nuclear Security Summit. And Harley, what Obama said was that he's more worried about the possibility of a nuclear weapon going off in Manhattan than any Russian threat. And I'll play that clip for you guys right here.
Russia's actions are a problem. They don't pose the number one national security threat to the United States. I continue to be much more concerned when it comes to our security with the prospect of a nuclear weapon going off in Manhattan.
Harley, given what I said about false flags and given what we know about the corruption within the United States government, does that soundbite from President Obama give you pause?
Well, it's the only thing he has left. The war on terror was an excuse from the beginning for restructuring policy in the United States to give more power to the corporations, including the national security state. And at this point, I think more than you might agree, there is a potential for an explosion in the United States. Now, it could be chaotic and terrible. That's why they have the war on terror, to try and terrorize people into submission. And if that doesn't work, a false flag becomes the next thing, the next step. Mm-hmm. You know, in going down memory lane, in January of 2001, Lyndon LaRouche said that the only way the Bush administration will be able to function, this is George W. Bush, would be with a Reichstag fire. And by the spring of that year, spring of 2001, LaRouche was warning of a terrorist attack in Washington, D.C. by September that could be used to establish emergency decrees. And that happened. And we see the same potential for that now, whether it's I don't know whether they would go to the point of triggering a nuclear device. I mean, they might, but they have operations in place that would justify a much more intense police crackdown, including, you know, the racial tension in the United States, which is being fanned like crazy by the politicians and the media.
Right.
So I do think we should take these things seriously. That's why we've got to get Obama out. And people who say, well, he's only in for a little bit longer, let's wage the right fight. We've got a traitor in the White House. We've got gutless cowards in our Congress and the House and the Senate. Let's force some of them to speak the truth and fight. And can it happen? I don't know. That's what I want to see happen. That's what I'm working to do.
Yeah, me too, Harley. And I just want to say this regarding Obama's comments about a nuclear device going off in Manhattan. The reason I bring that up, Harley, is if something as horrible and nightmarish, end of days style takes place like that, I want people to remember this phone call. I want people to remember this conversation, and I want people to do the research on who benefited and why did it happen and who was behind it. Because, Harley, as you know, 9/11 was clearly a false flag operation that involved aspects of Israel and the Mossad. And we know that the 7/7 bombings in London were a false flag operation. We have Peter Powers on the record saying that on the morning of the bombings, they were running a drill of the exact same scenario in the exact same place, and they had to switch their exercise to real world.
Today we were running an exercise for a company, bearing in mind I'm now in the private sector, and we sat everybody down in the city, 1,000 people involved in the whole organisation, but the crisis team, and the most peculiar thing was we based our scenario on the simultaneous attacks on the Underground and mainline station. So we had to suddenly switch an exercise from fictional to real.
And then there's ISIS, right? We know that this government is backing ISIS when...
Well, and it's happened again and again and again.
Yeah, right. And the point
and
is...
Each time they use it as an argument to say we've got to keep the Patriot Act in place. We've got to extend the spying. Yeah, it's obvious. And, you know, I think it's so obvious that people, even who are suckers for this, occasionally step back and say, am I really going to support another war? And I think this is where we have an opportunity now. But the only way, you know, the problem, Sean, is that when you say these things, when I say these things, people are saying, oh, you're exaggerating, you're trying to scare people. Well, we're telling you what we know. It's up to you to decide whether it's serious or not and whether you want to do something for your family and your future.
Right. Well, in conversations like this, Harley, too, we're only scratching the surface. It's far, far worse than what you and I have described. In fact, when you dig into 9/11, I've heard it said that it's like Chinese dolls. It's like a set of Chinese dolls. It's a crime within a crime within a crime within a crime. It's actually far worse than you and I.
And Sean, let me just add one other thing, because we didn't talk a whole lot about the financial system. But what Americans don't seem to realize is that the next crash, people will lose everything, because there's nothing backing up the dollar. The total global debt, including personal debt, private sector debt, not just government debt, the total debt is in the quadrillions of dollars. There's no way a bailout or a bail-in will cover it. People will lose their 401ks. They'll lose everything. And until people are really willing to face that reality, they're not going to do what's necessary to try and put up a firewall to protect against it, like a Glass-Steagall, or starting to arrest some of these criminals masquerading as Wall Street bankers. So it really has to become real to people that we are talking about something as cataclysmic as a nuclear device in Manhattan or a total meltdown of the financial system.
Right. Well said. Boy, I've never heard it said that way. Criminals masquerading as Wall Street bankers. You hit the nail on the head there, my friend. Harley, please tell everybody about your wonderful website and the work that you guys are doing over at LaRouche.
You can go to LaRouchePAC.com, LaRouchePAC.com, and I do this periodically. I'll give people my email address because I've been able to sustain communication with some of your listeners. If you want to speak to me personally or write to me, it's harleysch@gmail.com. That's harleysch@gmail.com. I welcome the input, including the debates and the arguments.
Well, very good, Harley. It's kind of you to extend that. And guys, please reach out respectfully to Harley. If you have something to say or talk about, please do. We appreciate you getting engaged. And Harley, we certainly appreciate your expertise and time. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Sean. Good to be with you again.
Good to be with you. And guys, thank you so much for your support at sgtreport.com, thephaser.com, where I handpick videos and stories to share on a daily basis, and thelibertymill.com. Real news 24/7. God bless and have a great week.